Surprisingly, instead of ordering their men to rush the barn and take Booth, they first sent an unarmed civilian to disarm him. When that scheme failed, they attempted to talk him out of the barn. Why didn't 26 armed soldiers, under the cloak of darkness, charge 2 civilians hiding in a barn? Surely the honor of capturing Lincoln's assassin was worth the risk of a few casualties. Baker shouted an ultimatum to the fugitives. "I want you to surrender. If you don't, I will burn this barn down in 15 minutes. Booth stepped to the front of the barn and peered through the space between 2 boards, examining the manhunters. "Who are you? What do you want? Whom do you want?" "We want you," Baker replied, "and we know who you are. Give up your arms and come out." Booth continued to stall, asking for time to make a decision. Baker agreed to the delay. Harold decided to give himself up. He thought he could talk his way out of trouble and just go home. In his mind, he wasn't guilty of anything. Booth had shot Lincoln, Powell had stabbed Seward, and he had just been along for the ride. Booth, however, refused to let Harold go. Harold pleaded with Booth, begging to be released. Finally, Booth relented, denouncing his companion. "You damn coward! Go! Go!" Harold had stood by Booth, even when he had had a chance to leave. He had rendered loyal service, and it was harsh to call him a coward now. Harold turned away from Booth and faced the door. He thrust one empty hand at a time through the door frame where the soldiers could see them. Doherty sprung to the door, seized Harold by the wrist, and yanked him through the doorway. He frisked him to make sure he was unarmed and, like a schoolmaster taking a disobedient student by the collar, marched him away from the barn. Now there remained only John Wilkes Booth, still at bay and armed. For Booth, this was his final and greatest performance, not just for the small audience of soldiers at Garrett's barn, but also for history. He had already committed the most daring public murder in American history. Indeed, he had performed it, fully staged before an audience at Ford's Theater. Tonight he would script his own end, with a performance that equaled his triumph at Ford's. Baker and Conger argued against waiting until morning to take Booth. In a few hours, the light of dawn would illuminate the manhunters and make them into perfect, visible targets. Booth could hardly miss. One of Doherty's sergeants, Boston Corbett, volunteered for a suicide mission. He would slip into the barn alone and fight Booth one-on-one. 3 times Corbett volunteered. Each time, Doherty ordered Corbett back to his position. Conger and Baker had another plan. They wanted to burn the barn. The flames and smoke would do the job of flushing Booth out, without harm to the men. Conger ordered the Garrett sons to collect a few armfuls of straw and pile them against the side of the barn. The rustling sounds alerted Booth, who rushed to the side of the noise. He ordered the Garretts to move away from the barn or he would shoot them. They quickly retreated out of pistol range. Anticipating the barn was about to be burned down, Booth challenged all of his pursuers to honorable combat on open ground. He had just challenged 26 men, a lieutenant and 2 detectives, to a duel. Baker declined the offer. "Well, my brave boys, prepare a stretcher for me," Booth replied merrily. Conger bent over and lit the kindling. The pine twigs and straw burst into flames that licked the dry, weathered boards. Soon the barn caught fire, and within minutes the corner of the barn blazed brightly. The fire cast a yellow-orange glow that flickered eerily across the faces of the soldiers. Booth could see them clearly now, but held his fire. As the fire grew, it lit the inside of the barn so that for the first time the soldiers could also see their quarry in the gaps between the slats. The assassin had 3 choices: stay in the barn and burn alive, blow his brains out, or script his own honorable end by hobbling out the front door and doing battle with the manhunters, welcoming death, but risking capture. Booth decided it was better to die than be taken back to Washington to face justice. He did not wish to bear the spectacle of a trial that would put him on public display for the amusement of the press and curiosity seekers, nor did he wish to endure the rituals of a hanging, being bound and blindfolded, parading past his own coffin and open grave, climbing the steps of the scaffold. The shameful death of a common criminal was not for him. It was far better to perish here. Booth stood in the center of the barn, awkwardly balancing the carbine in one hand, the pistol in the other, and a crutch under one arm. Measuring how quickly the flames were engulfing him, he hopped forward, the carbine in his right hand, the butt plate balanced against his hip. Outside the barn, Conger, Baker, Doherty, and the cavalrymen tensed for action. No one could endure the hot flames and choking smoke for long. They expected the door to swing open at any moment and see Booth emerge with his hands up or his pistols blazing. Boston Corbett watched the assassin's every move inside the barn. Unseen by Booth, he walked up to one side of the barn and peeked between one of the gaps in the barn walls. As the flames grew brighter, Corbett could see his prey clearly. The sergeant watched Booth and drew his pistol. Booth leveled the carbine against his hip as though preparing to bring it into firing position. Corbett poked the barrel of his revolver through the slit in the wall, aimed at Booth, and fired. The soldiers heard one shot. Instantly, Booth dropped the carbine and crumpled to his knees. Like sprinters cued by a starting gun, Baker rushed into the barn with Conger at his heels. Conger seized the assassin's pistol. They lifted Booth from the floor, carried him under the trees a few yards from the door, and laid him on the grass. Though unable to move, Booth opened his eyes and attempted to speak. Conger called for water, poured a little into Booth's mouth, and he spit it out. The assassin could not swallow. He was completely paralyzed. For the first time in his life, the great actor was at a loss for words. His voice was silenced by the bullet that had quickly passed through his neck and spinal column. After several attempts at speaking, Booth whispered, "Tell mother I'd die for my country." It was hard to hear his faint voice above the roar of the fire, the shouts of the men, and the snorting of the horses. As the blaze in the barn grew to an inferno, the soldiers retreated to the garret house, moving Booth's limp body onto the porch near the bench where Booth had sat, smoked, napped, and chatted over the previous 2 days. Blood seeped from the entry and exit wounds in his neck, pooled under his head, staining the floorboards. Doherty brought David Harold to the porch, bound his hands, and tied him to a tree about 2 yards from where Booth lay. Harold would have a front row seat for the climax of the chase for Lincoln's killer. Booth suffered extreme pain whenever he was moved. "Kill me," he begged the soldiers. "Kill me, kill me." "We don't want to kill you," Conger reassured him. "We want you to get well." He was sincere. They wanted Booth alive so they could bring him back to Washington as a prize for Edwin Stanton. Stanton and the others were certain Booth was merely an agent of a Confederate conspiracy. Following the swearing in of Andrew Johnson as the 17th president, Stanton had issued a reward for Jefferson Davis and other Confederate officials, naming them as assassination conspirators. 2 other captured conspirators, Michael O'Laughlin and Sam Arnold, had already confessed everything they knew about the plot. If Booth talked too, he might reveal valuable information that implicated the highest officials in the Confederacy. But because of someone under Conger's command, it was obvious Booth was not going back to Washington alive. Who fired the shot? Conger demanded to know. Boston Corbett came forward, snapped to attention, saluted Conger, and proclaimed that he had shot Booth, and Providence had directed him to do it. He claimed he opened fire because he thought Booth was going to shoot the soldiers. He did it to protect the lives of his fellow troopers. In fact, the men of the 16th New York had not been ordered to hold their fire. Conger, Baker, and Doherty had failed to give them any order at all on the subject. As a non-commissioned officer, Corbett exercised his own discretion and shot Booth. A local doctor was summoned. He examined Booth, who lapsed in and out of consciousness. He proclaimed the wound was mortal. Booth would not recover. Conger rifled through Booth's pockets, then placed the contents in a handkerchief. Booth's diary, money, keys, compass, small knife, and tobacco would be taken to Stanton as treasures and evidence. "My hands," Booth whispered. Baker raised them for Booth to see. For the last time, John Wilkes Booth saw the hands, now helpless, that had slain Abraham Lincoln. Gathering his remaining strength, he looked at his hands and spoke his last words. "Useless. Useless." Booth's lips turned purple and his throat swelled. He gasped. The rising sun nudged above the horizon and colored the eastern sky, flooding the Garrett farm with light, which shone above Booth's face. The stage grew dark for him. His body shuddered. John Wilkes Booth was dead. The 12-day chase for Abraham Lincoln's assassin was over.